If you struggle with your backswing or struggle with a consistent swing at all, how you start your golf swing, the takeaway from address to shaft parallel, is a massively important part of your swing that you absolutely want to master. We're going to cover 3 key elements that every golfer should have in their takeaway. I'm going to show you what they are, how to do them, and then how to ingrain them. You've got to master the setup first. And for so many golfers, it's where the pelvis is in relation to their feet that really makes or breaks their golf swing, but certainly the takeaway.
And this is something I have to watch myself like a hawk because...
Same here.
Because of the hawk, Ben Hogan. I read his book when I was about 12 years old, and there's this famous image of him sitting on the bar stool.
So go down the line and demonstrate sitting on a bar stool.
It would be like the way I took it, and again, a written word, and the way I took it was kind of like sitting back.
Yeah, so what you're gonna notice, do that again, is his shins are pretty vertical, his butt's way behind his heels, and I can very easily just nudge him off of balance.
I mean, I played a whole summer.
If you set up like that,
which
everyone kind of over the age of 40 knows about sitting on a bar stool and the golf swing setup.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
No, so I really, when I'm playing, it's the one thing that goes first. I start hitting it bad right away.
Immediately.
So you have to really, I know nobody really wants to watch setup videos, but this is so important because everything else is predicated on it.
It takes no talent to set up.
Exactly.
So some of you like to complain about I'm not as flexible or as young as I used to be. It takes no talent to do what we're going to show you today. Set up again instead. I'm going to put our wall, which is our AMG playing cushion.
The playing board, baby.
A club head's width behind his heel. Okay, so right there. So you got, what is that, 3.5, 4 inches maybe at the most?
Yeah.
Now, if you don't have a cushion, you can use a box. You can use, because I work on this all the time, I won't walk down a hallway in my house without doing this and just constantly reminding myself where that feel is.
And you're going to try to get in your address position by bending from the hip joints. So it's more of a bending over a fence. We've said it a million times, it's such a good image. I was looking over a fence. I can't bang my knees into the fence because I can't see over it. It's like I'm looking over it, trying to peek over it. And then once I get to the point where I'm almost falling over, I just crack my knees a little bit and I can get my setup here without even really being into this wall.
No, you should have a little buffer there. You should be able to slide your hand between your butt and the wall when you're in a good setup. Now,
I can just barely maybe feel it somewhere in there, depending I guess on your...
No pressure at all.
How long your legs are and torso, but you definitely don't want to shove this thing over.
Now you're going to feel different muscles and tendons firing if you're not used to doing this.
And you may feel a touch out of balance, but you probably aren't. It's just a different balance point.
That's a good point. You're going to be in balance for the swing.
Yeah.
Golfers like to set up in balance for the setup. Because as soon as I start moving that club behind me, this is going to counterbalance. We want to be set up for the
dynamic
motion,
setup.
not the setup.
We want to make a dynamic setup.
Yes.
That's a good point. We always get, I call it hunkered down. Interestingly enough, the most in-shape people do this the worst because they're usually in the gym. And when you do squats and deadlifts, it's just kind of like rigid, arched back, kind of like squatting down.
The key to avoid here is when we bend over, we're used to counterbalancing that by throwing the butt back. You want to try to bend over without throwing the butt back. And you're going to feel like your toes are gripping the ground.
Yeah, almost like to the point you're going to fall over and you just crack your knees to settle your feet into the ground. And once you get your club on the ground, just hang your arms down under your shoulders. Also, make sure, one last little tidbit here, make sure that when you get here and I put this club across my back, you don't want a huge gap here because that means you're arching your lower back too much.
Right.
And that's going to ruin your takeaway.
Yep, you want that kind of flattish. Okay, so we've got that dialed in. Again, no talent to set up correctly. Now let's talk about setting the club. Okay, so what we see all the time in takeaways is this kind of motion where I have a cup in my left wrist and then I flatten that out. If you're filming yourself or watching yourself in a mirror do a takeaway, oh, that looks pretty good. But the problem is, as soon as I make body movement and rotation, now the club is sucked in and way out of position, and I'll have to,
it's hard to manage.
Go in here, lift, and usually comes out. So instead, you gotta get this club set properly.
So,
or not really, it's not much set, it's just not setting it poorly.
Yeah, and everyone's probably seen this wrist training aid. It's actually very good. We use it a little different sometimes. So in the normal way is to have it lined up for your lead arm, where this is right on top of the club. We got this from Scott Hamilton. Put it down on the bottom of the grip, rotate it about 45 degrees to the right. Now it's going to be a little training for your takeaway, where you have to not make the motion that Mike was just talking about, because it never gets on your wrist.
So do that again. You're bowing this wrist, cupping it, keeping the face pancaked.
Yep.
That's no good, because as soon as you add body turn to that,
Oh yeah,
it's out. It's
that
unplayable.
and that.
Yep.
So like now you've got the mass behind you. You've got to do something to get it out in front of you. So kind of cool. You know, you'll have a little gap here between your wrist and the right forearm, and the feeling is just kind of pitching it up as you make your turn, and it gives you an absolutely perfect takeaway, because it gets some up in the club head and not so much horizontal in the club head. If I just did it here, you can see where that club would be. It'd be out in front of me, but if I could add that little pivot, that's how you get the club in position here.
I'm going to add one more thing to that. Go back to the address.
Yeah.
Get a little elevation with the trail arm as you're doing that. So it's working up off you. Now do that facing the camera, and you'll see the hands kind of move beyond the leg right there, because you don't want all that set happening right here inside the legs.
And part of it is just making sure you move your lead shoulder.
Exactly.
Like when you're practicing this, you don't get so focused on the wrist. Make sure that this lead shoulder, you know, if I had a dot right here, I'm going to move that away from Mike's hand.
In the takeaway, that moves.
Yeah, and people will get confused that that's a big head movement. It's not. It's the direction of the shoulder turn. The plane of the shoulders is less like downward. It's more across. My head doesn't have to move a lot, and I can make a perfect takeaway with the right amount of spacing here, because it's not a quick wrist set like this. It's just more of a forearm motion, and eventually it'll start getting up on your wrist here. It's just the idea that the direction of the wrist hinge is more upward and not as inward.
And it's out. Then I add the turn, and then it's right there where it needs to be, which leads us to number 3, which is the turn.
Yeah. So what we just did kind of here would be the main takeaway is making this shoulder go across. There's a little bit of shift into the right foot. And you wouldn't really get on the wrist completely till up in here a little bit. You made a good point there a minute ago. We do not advocate an early wrist set. Not a fan of it, because usually you end up casting it. So it's a quieter wrist. It's more of a getting the forearms rotated. And you can see the direction that it goes in at that point, if I kept going, is going to sit right on my forearm. And man, this gives me a perfect backswing.
Go back to the face-on view.
Yeah.
So if you make roughly a 90-degree shoulder turn, then you want to think about this in thirds. So the takeaway is 30 degrees.
Yeah, so this is 90.
Yep.
60, 30, basically.
Yep.
Right
So
in there.
shaft parallel 30, arm parallel 60, the top right around 90. Now, if you don't make a 90-degree shoulder turn, think of it half in the takeaway. Now that needs to be double of what the pelvis is.
Right.
So you want to create that separation right out of the gate.
Because if you don't, let's say you don't have that turn with your shoulders, a lot of you are just going to whip the arms back here, and you might get the wrist set, you know, the wrist motion direction correct, but you haven't made any kind of turn. And we have a lot of golfers that come in and just kind of do that. They just move the arm across.
That's the damaging part about getting this club set behind you, is you won't turn.
Yeah.
Even if you can, you won't turn, because you'll pay a heavy penalty on where this ball goes if you get the club sucked in behind you and then turn. Unplayable. Those are the 3 keys for a solid takeaway. Set up with your body in position for a dynamic swing, not a dynamics or not a static setup where it feels comfortable at setup. Make sure your club is not setting improperly. It just does that. I mean, there's not much to it.
Not much set. It's just the plane of the set.
That's
right?
exactly
it's the
right. The
direction
plane of the set.
Yep.
Don't try to get this face pancake. It just sets up, and then allow your shoulder to move this way, creating that separation that we all want at the top of the swing. It's got to happen early, and the early is right in the takeaway. Is there any one drill we like to do for this?
I mean, I would call this probably a drill.
Right.
Do you have another one in mind you're thinking of?
I actually like to get in the proper setup. So walk it with a good setup,
Yeah.
good hinge, and then move it over, and then check yourself from down the line.
Okay.
Okay, so you should be here. The club should be roughly parallel over my toe line.
And you want, you know, wide enough to have some gap.
Gap, and then my shoulders moved without. That's one way to move the shoulder, but like you said earlier, it's getting this turn. I can feel the stretch already starting to happen. Then from here, you can do the lag video, or the lag drill, and just kind of float load it in and chip out there. But this is really focusing on the takeaway.
Yeah, and just to pound home one last point, if you make the hinge and you can't the butt of the club didn't move at all, you know you overcooked it.
Right.
So it's left shoulder across. Eventually it'll set on your wrist up in here. You want this gap here. Getting this takeaway and set up correct is that first domino. You want to get the dominoes going in the right direction early. You don't want to knock the first domino this way, and then I got to somehow stand it back up and flip the domino the other way. You get these dominoes going, and the big swing just becomes so much more natural, and you don't have to put a lot of compensations in
The beauty about this, about owning this part of your golf swing, is you'll learn it slowly, but then you'll start to really blaze through it. Now you've developed a backswing that produces really good downswings when you learn this well enough to not think about it and speed up.